the Taoiseach earlier, and there are certainly one or two points I want to take issue with. He said we needed a debate to draw out what we mean by neutrality. And of course, this motion this morning is certainly doing that. We do need that debate, and that is what we are having here this morning. But I note that the government amendment, you say, that the government is committed to a Dáil debate on the outcome of the consultative forum that you established, and that you will consider in this light whether to bring forward a set of specific follow-up actions and policy recommendations building on the report of the forum, etc. Minister, you accuse us of closing down the debate, whereas in fact your amendment considerably narrows the focus of the debate. Your proposal, as I said, is to debate the outcome of the forum and bring forward, if appropriate, recommendations building on its report. If that's the extent of the discussion, rather than a broader, open discussion on neutrality, and this motion would certainly be a useful part of this discussion, if that's the extent of your proposals, then you need to examine your conscience, as the Taoiseach already said, about closing down aspects of this important debate. I don't consider this motion to be the final word on any discussion on neutrality. Far from it. But it is an open, reasonably balanced attempt to look at many of the different aspects that impact on our neutrality. Again, your motion says, and I quote, "The government does not believe a referendum enshrining neutrality in the Constitution is appropriate." So, Minister, it seems you have already made that decision before any debate, before any discussion. And you say we are the ones closing down the possibility of drawing out what is meant by neutrality. I would have thought, Minister, that any referendum on neutrality would be the end point of very detailed discussions, rather than a decision being taken that it wouldn't even be considered. Now, I agree with the Taoiseach regarding simplistic constitutional amendments. They would hold real risks, but nobody is suggesting simplistic constitutional amendments. We didn't suggest a wording. We simply suggested that work needs to be done to find a wording and then put that to the people. Taoiseach, I would have thought that our Constitution provides the very foundation for our action on neutrality. The Defence Amendment Act 1960, which stipulated that overseas deployment of our defence forces could only happen with UN approval, and a resolution by the Dáil, was built on by the Triple Lock Amendment to our Constitution as part of the Nice Treaty. So saying that we cannot or should not touch our Constitution in order to refine or update it in regard to our policy on neutrality as a starting point rather than an end point to any discussion is, in my view, closing down certain aspects of the debate. The Taoiseach said that this motion, if passed, would constrain the executive's ability to exercise its policy-making and authority in respect to the conduct of external relations articulated in Article 29 of the Constitution. I'd certainly like to see more clarity on that, Minister. I've looked very carefully at what we called for. We called to affirm and reiterate our steadfast commitment to neutrality, to hold a referendum, to maintain and strengthen our role as a responsible, non-aligned, impartial nation, to continue to support international peacekeeping, to work to raise the awareness of neutrality, to ensure the inspection of civilian warplanes to be lawful, to properly fund and resource our defence forces, and confirm and ensure that Irish Defence Forces personnel are not and will not be involved in lethal weapons training to foreign military forces. Can you tell me how would any of that constrain the ability of the executive to act What actions are you thinking of taking that would be constrained by this? Minister, this motion is a reasonable ask. We want to be part of the debate on neutrality, and we want to see that it is not constrained by being based only on the recommendations of the forum.
It's an extremely important topic, as you well know, and I know it's dear to your own heart. I mightn't agree with all of your views on it. And I have put this motion today with the help of my colleagues, Thomas Pringle, Joan Collins, Michael McNamara, Marion Harkin and Michael Fitzmaurice, and I look forward to the support of other small parties and bigger parties here today. And I do this not to embarrass the government, not to be contentious, not to be argumentative, because now more than ever, with the focus on what's happening in Gaza, it's bringing into acute focus how we should use our neutral role in a very, very active manner. So I have to say, when I see your counter motion or your amendment, I've often used the word despair, and I try not to use it because we need to give hope. But I despair of what the government has put back in response to my motion. I've set out the articles in the Constitution, the most recent one put in after the Nice Treaty. I've set it all out, and you've absolutely ignored it. You haven't even acknowledged it in your counter motion, that there's a constitutional basis here obliging us to take a peaceful role in the world. And then following the various referendums, we put in declarations, guarantees, warranties that we would not abandon our neutral policy. So, going back to the Single European Act's ratification in 1987, it was acknowledged that Ireland's long-established policy of military neutrality was lodged along with the Single European Act's ratification instrument. The Maastricht Treaty in 1992, the treaty shall not prejudice the specific character of the security and defence policy of certain member states, including Ireland. The Nice Treaty, when the people of Ireland voted against Nice, the Seville Declaration was put in to facilitate the holding of a second referendum. That took us up to 2001 and 2. And the insertion of Article 29.9, which I've laid out into Bunrock na HÉireann, that the state would not take part in any EU common defence arrangement. Then we move forward to 2008 and 2009, the Lisbon Treaty, and when the first Lisbon Treaty was rejected, we have a guarantee put in to facilitate the holding of a second referendum. We've had repeated polls confirming the support of the Irish people to Irish neutrality, and the most recent Irish Time poll in June 23 found that 61% of the people surveyed favoured the retention of the current model of neutrality. And even the Consultative Forum, which you published the report, and I thank you for that, and I have serious problems with the way that was initiated and the way it was conducted. But I quote even from that, the Consultative Forum on International Security Policy, and the title alone, I hope I have time to come back to it. The chairperson acknowledges it was frequently expressed and rarely contradicted that there is currently no popular mandate in Ireland to abandon the policy of neutrality. There was a palpable and widely held sense of pride in Ireland's value-based foreign policy and global reputation as honest brokers, and so on. There was a particularly strong sense of pride in Ireland's history of peacekeeping since 1958, an unbroken record with 508 Irish soldiers deployed overseas as of the 1st of October this year. A considerable majority, and that's use of words that when we have the debate I'll come back to, a considerable majority of those who spoke on this topic expressed the view that there is presently no public appetite for a change to the current position on neutrality, and so on. I know you have repeatedly confirmed, Taoiseach, that you have no intention of joining NATO, and I take that on board. However, I find your statements in relation to our neutrality extremely worrying. Agus gan doubt tá blas na breg crofachta I gceist, tá breg crofach go smir sna ráiteas a hagan the Rhine. So while you say that you are not going to change our neutrality, your reply or your motion today, or your amendment tells us you have no plan at the moment. Now, given the history that I've just outlined, no plan, that's exactly what it says, no plan at the moment to change neutrality. The government reaffirms its commitment to a policy of military neutrality and reiterates that it has no plans to join a military alliance. There's no plans. Okay, so let me just look at what we're doing here, Taoiseach. 20 years ago, there was an illegal war in Iraq. You remember that? Huge protests on the street. I was part of 100,000 people that were on the streets of Dublin. I think over 1 million people in London. An illegal war, fabricated reasons and propaganda. 20 years later, Guantanamo Bay is still open, just to bring home the consequences of what happens when we let a consensus mentality and propaganda take over. 20 years later, the UN rapporteur, and her title is very interesting, the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms while Countering Terrorism. Fionnuala Ní Shaoláin, an Talamh Fionnuala Ní Shaoláin. And 20 years later, when she visits Guantanamo Bay, and she praises the Biden regime for allowing her and for helping out in allowing her technical visit. And I'm just going to read out, because it's important really to say, the Special Rapporteur, 20 years later, reaffirms the UN Special Procedures finding of structured, discriminatory and systematic rendition, secret detention and torture and ill-treatment at multiple, including black sites and at Guantanamo Bay. She acknowledges that the vast majority of the men rendered and detained there were brought without cause and had no relationship whatsoever with the events that took place on 9/11. Every one of the 780 Muslim men who was held at Guantanamo Bay, including the 30 that remain there 30 years later, live with their own distinct experiences of unrelenting psychological and physical trauma. Now, I have to say, Taoiseach, this report is a moderate report in context. She looks at the victims and the effect on victims as well. She follows up 3 different strands, one of which are the prisoners and what they suffered. And I use that to say that 20 years later, that is just one of the consequences of what we allowed happen, an illegal war in Iraq based on propaganda. And so today we look, and in the context of Gaza, and we have rightly condemned Hamas. There has been absolutely no condemnation of Israel for the breach of international law. Absolutely no condemnation. And if we look at Hamas, and we look at who were the greatest supporters of Hamas, let me quote from Netanyahu back in 2019. Benjamin Netanyahu's statement at a March 2019 meeting of his Likud party's Knesset members, reported in Haaretz, the paper. Hamas was treated as a partner to the detriment of the Palestinian Authority to prevent Abbas from moving towards creating a Palestinian state. Hamas was promoted from a terrorist group to an organization with which Israel conducted negotiations through Egypt, and which was allowed to receive suitcases containing millions of dollars and so on. This is Benjamin Netanyahu back in 19. That has been repeatedly printed in various media to say that was the active policy of them in relation to Hamas. You might reflect on that, Taoiseach. In relation to our neutrality, I have seen repeated comments, actually just on that, I'm just going to finish on that one, and it's been reported Hamas as a partner. Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. That's what Netanyahu told a meeting of his party members in March 19, reported in lots of papers. And we go back then to the neutrality motion that I have before us today. And I have no idea, if you're committed to neutrality, why you couldn't accept even the first part of the motion, which sets out our tradition, our constitutional provisions, the comments of the Supreme Court in the very case took by the very courageous Ed Horgan, who acknowledged that the traditional policy of neutrality was dearly held by the Irish people. I have no idea why you couldn't have acknowledged that and come back to us to give us reasons why it can't be enshrined in the Constitution. You are going against the wishes of the majority of the people in Ireland. My experience, my reading, my listening has told me that the vast majority of people in Ireland want neutrality as an active policy enshrined in our Constitution and allowing us to take a proud position in the world in relation to conflict resolution. Building on our own past, on our northern troubles, what we've done in Colombia, and we've been very proud of that, what we've done throughout the world, why we cannot enshrine that in a constitution, other than your argument yesterday at the forum and presumably today that we need flexibility. Now, neutrality, if anything, has been extremely flexible since its origins, back with Wolfe Tone. It has allowed great flexibility to each government. But the kernel is that we remain non-aligned. The kernel is that we're not afraid to speak truth to power, as in this case with Israel. While I have the utmost understanding from where the Israeli people have come from and the Jewish people, absolutely understand their fears and their dread. However, what they have done to Gaza is simply unacceptable. An open-air prison for almost 17 years. A refugee status in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank from 70 years. Constant humiliation and degradations. And we have the UN General Secretary begging for a humanitarian opening for trucks to go in. 1 or 2 trucks, 20 trucks, when on a daily basis up to now, somewhere I understand between 100 and 500 trucks were needed to keep the people alive, 80% of whom are absolutely dependent on outside help and humanitarian assistance. And now we're not even letting in 1 truck. And we have the humanitarian organisations and the UN organisations telling us that they're going to pull out tonight. Collective punishment of the Palestinian people is a war crime. It's against all international human rights provisions, laws, and so on. I have no idea why we cannot stand up and say that, and use our voice to say, what you're doing is wrong, we will work with you for a peaceful solution. I have no idea why we can't do that, Tánaiste. I don't know why we have to play games, or why there's hypocrisy, we'll say something but not say something else. If we go back to the An Talamh Fionnuala Ní Sheileán and her title, it's worth looking at that because there was absolutely no mention of human rights in your consultative forum. Look at your title, look at the framing of that. And I'm not going to use too much of my time on that, except to say I was horrified at the manner in which it was set up and the framing of the discussion, and no mention of human rights, no open discussion on neutrality. No open discussion on how neutrality could serve us, but a framing in terms of terror, fear, and the war industry. You can shake your head all you like, Tánaiste, but at the end of the day, you and I have to talk to each other as human beings, and we have to find a way to reflect what the people of Ireland want. And shaking our heads, I've resorted to shaking my head myself. It doesn't really help matters, does it? But what you need to do is tell us why you think that we need to be more flexible in our neutrality policy. given the debacle that has ensued following Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's war on the Palestinian people, the debacle in Europe, the comments by van der Leyen and other people, and we waiting for a common response. We're a sovereign nation, a sovereign independent country that we fought dearly for that status. Why aren't we using our voice loudly and clearly to Israel, equally to Hamas, and also to bring a perspective to the whole situation that's different from Europe? The veto has been put forward as one of the reasons, the misuse of the veto, as to why we should get rid of the triple lock. The triple lock was vital in getting the various treaties passed, that we would need a UN resolution, that we would need the government and the Dáil. And repeated statements from you are telling us that that needs to be changed with more flexibility, without any analysis of what has happened in relation to the veto in the UN. And I agree it has been misused on occasions by Russia, by America, almost equally, if you look at the whole history of the veto. And recently, I understand, when Brazil brought a motion in relation to stopping the war or having a humanitarian pause, it was America that objected to that. Now, I understand when you look at Biden's speeches, not his less nuanced speeches, but the more nuanced speeches, if I might put it like that, he's saying, don't do what we did. Don't do what we did in Iraq and have the consequences of that. And you know, when you talk about training, and it brings in really hypocrisy to the fore, and we will send troops and soldiers over to train Ukrainian people to defend themselves, it would never happen, or never even be conceived that we would send our soldiers or our army to help the people of Gaza. So I'm not saying one should or shouldn't do it. I'm asking you to reflect on our hypocrisy, how we'll take a certain stand and a certain narrative when it suits the powers, and when it doesn't, we'll do something else. That's not what neutrality means. I won't go over my time,
Motion and against the government's counter-motion. I listened very carefully to what the Taoiseach had to say before he quickly departed the chamber. It seems to me that he has offered no reason whatsoever why the government is unprepared to even accept Ireland's traditional position of neutrality and encapsulate that in the counter-motion, as Deputy Connolly pointed out. It's almost as if we're embarrassed by Ireland's history of neutrality. Now, during the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and I'll call it a war because only the Irish government and the Russian government seem to say it's not a war. The Russian government called it a special military operation, the Irish government for their own reasons, because they're training now people who are belligerents in what the Russians regard as a war, start to say, well, it's not a war and we're training people to defend themselves. I mean, we're training belligerents, rightly or wrongly, we're training belligerents in a war. And I think we should discuss the rights and the wrongs of that in this chamber. The Taoiseach accuses us of wanting to shut down and preempt debate, but we're not. What we want to do is hand that debate over to the Irish people by way of a referendum, because this Dáil does not allow for debate. It really doesn't. The original motion referred to Horgan and the Taoiseach, Horgan versus an Taoiseach. Now, we must accept that the President of the High Court, who delivered judgment in that, held against the plaintiff, Dr. Horgan, and found that the use of Shannon Airport and the use of Ireland generally did not conflict with our constitutional provisions. But that's a huge step, though, I would respectfully say, from that to where we're at now, which is arming belligerents with non-lethal weapons and training them in the use of lethal weapons. And Horgan looked very much at a lot of US cases where he talked about the rivalry and the challenges between the executive and the legislature when it came to the declaration of war. Now, let's be honest. This legislature, as it has evolved since the foundation of the state, never seriously challenges the executive, and less so now than ever before. So we don't have a system as exists for all of its faults and all of its very many and manifest and evident faults in the American system, where you do have a legislature that can hold the executive to account, particularly on such crucial matters. We don't have that here. So the only people who can hold the executive, who can constrain the executive, as the Taoiseach is so terribly afraid of being constrained, well, the only people who can constrain them are the people by way of an election. And by then, of course, if you've declared war on somebody, it's a little bit late. So that's why the people should be given a voice now to debate and to determine what constraints they want to put on the executive. And, there are lots of examples. There are constitutionally neutral states, just as there are states that are neutral by I've heard people even say Ireland is neutral by accident of geography. Well, so are lots of other countries. Austria's arguably neutral by accident of history and geography, just as Ireland is. Nevertheless, they're avowedly neutral, and it served them very well. It's actually, I would have thought, been to their economic and financial benefit as well as their geopolitical benefit, just as it has been to Ireland up to now. But we like to forget that and it might be a little bit embarrassing if you look back at the Second World War and the words that we used or failed to use against the Nazi regime. If you compare them to the bellicose words that both the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach have had about Russia, about how it was barbaric, a rogue state, I couldn't find enough words with which to condemn Vladimir Putin. But I don't hear those words being used. If it's wrong, and it is wrong, if it is wrong to bomb civilian areas and target essential civilian infrastructure in Bakhmut, in Mariupol, or in any of those places, it's equally wrong in Gaza. But those words aren't there, because we want to be part of the club. And the Taoiseach is obsessed with being part of the club, and people see that, and that's why it is important to constrain the executive, because we might have as weak a Taoiseach again in future who's so desperate to curry favour with his partners, as we call them. The Count Corley used the word ally when introducing Zelensky, which I found a very inappropriate word to use in the circumstances. We may sympathise with him, but that doesn't make him an ally. So I very much, the last thing, which just the very last point I would make, is people talk about how the risks that in here now, and it's unprecedented. For all of the military alliances that the countries in the Nord Stream that are served by Nord Stream are in, it didn't stop it being targeted. We still don't know even who targeted it. Thank you.
Mentioned Kate O'Shea's and talked to Connolly and her group putting forward this motion, and I know how passionate she feels about this topic. I've listened to her many, many times here. But Minister, Minister Taras, this is very, very important, because we have, since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, we have diminished, damaged and destroyed almost our neutrality and our record. And we have this debate before, and you're going to nod with me. Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach says, and Rick saying our neutrality is an outdated concept now. Imagine. For if he hasn't done enough damage to this country, he wants to damage our neutrality. I salute the peacekeepers that have gone out, and I think of the people in Jadotville and the battle there, and what Micheál Martin promised them before he was going to power. What he'd do from now, he wouldn't even meet him. Men, that survivors are there and can't get the recognition they're getting it. I see now they're getting it from Australia. I think there's a Canadian Parliament, Australian Parliament. So our neutrality is so important to us here. Our Irish passport is so important to us here. And our everything Irish is so important to us. And we're entitled to have that. We can punch above our weight if we have the clean image of being neutral. Not sending out bombs and have the Ukrainian flag flying out here beside the tricolour. I think that is scandalous. And it's undermining our neutrality as well. And it's time we copped onto ourselves now. I happened to go out yesterday evening at dusk and saw the military police taking down the tricolour, as they do, and the Ukrainian flag, up and down every day, as important as if our own tricolour. We need to cop ourselves on here. And we need Micheál Martin and our Taoiseach to go out and tell Ursula von der Leyen that she can make those comments that she made. The EU now just want to be kind of warmongering as well, and we're tagging on and be nice guys. And I heard the Taoiseach yesterday talking to Dr. MacDonald that she has to learn what happens in diplomacy, 27 countries, whatever. We stand for ourselves. We stand for Ireland. Proud people, proud of our soldiers that went out and are going out and are out there at the moment down in bunkers and I hope they'll come back safely. Some from my own village in Tipperary, a proud record of service as a neutral country. But what's going on here with this Deputy Martin and his idea that our neutrality is outdated. He held his roadshow going around. He got his answer. The 4 venues he went around to try and get the people ready, like a citizen assembly event, ready up the people for a change here. He's the man that's completely going to change everything. Stand by our neutrality. It has stood us well.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Our neutrality is of huge value to this country, Minister, and it's something I find more and more of late with senior ministers kind of questioning it and kicking it around as if it's a political football. It's not a political football. It's of utmost of importance to this country, because we got to look at for 2 reasons. Number one is our defence force are poorly funded, and we've seen in recent times with helicopters flying, losing doors, Russian ships floating over our communication signals, our cables are underseas off the southwest coast, and we're able to do nothing about it. We are in a very difficult position if we're going to take on the world with our viewpoints and our senior ministerial viewpoints. We have to work towards peace. There's a very upset world out there, a world that's facing, heading, like somebody said to me recently, to a world war. And instead, are we being at the forefront where we can be for peace in our country? We're now starting to take sides. Starting to stoke up unrest with parts of the world that we shouldn't be. So, Minister, it's time to step back. The majority of the people in this country want us to stay neutral. That's the majority. The polls are out there, and I'm quite proud to think that we're living in a country that is neutral, but we need to work on that neutrality and work with the bad people out there and the good people out there to try and see, can we marry them together and create peace in this world, and create the peace out in the Gazas and the peace in Ukraine, and not to be seen to take sides and causing more conflict and more anger. And Deputy McGrath did mention about our good people that fought there before in Jeddah and places like that haven't been recognised and have met with us recently. But also, I'd like to pay tribute to the peacekeeping forces in Lebanon and places who have been doing their utmost best, and losses of lives because of that. But, Minister, it's an opportunity now that needs to be won.